Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. Today is November 15th, and as always, I alert you when we are pre recording in case there's some major development, since the pace of things in the world is very, very rapid these days, that I don't happen to mention right now. I'm very excited, having been recently in Paris at the conference both of Solidarité et Progrès and the Schiller Institute and the International Youth Movement on the topic of creating a youth movement and the development of Africa, that the leader of the French association, the French LaRouche movement, Jacques Cheminade, who is the president of Solidarité et Progrès, our party in France, longtime LaRouche associate, spent some time in the United States, has quite a background, and three-time presidential candidate, will be with us. And I think this is very important because if you look at the world right now, we have the continually ongoing Ukraine-Russia war, which the Russians are gradually winning. Donald Trump said he would end this war, but seems not to understand or be allowed to understand the the complex conditions behind the provocation of Russia by NATO, by the British, and by the Biden Obama, or what some people call the deep state in the United States. We have the insanity of a potentially looming invasion of Venezuela. We have the ongoing slaughter of the Palestinian people. There is supposed to be a peace agreement between Israel and as yet to be formed Palestinian state, Palestinian governing authority. These things would be much more easily addressed if the United States would embody its intended identity, which was as a bulwark against colonialism, that the principles in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, that every human being is born equal with unalienable rights, that is, rights by nature of the fact that we are human in the image of the Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not property, but the development of our creative potential, that this is the right not only of people within the borders of the United States, but of every human being on the planet. And the way you secure these rights is not by force, but by the consent of the governed, because as soon as you are forcing it, as soon as you seek to impose it, then you've taken away the question of liberty. Human beings don't function by force, and that's another story. So what I asked my friend Jacques Cheminade to bring to us is the beginning of a discussion of the international conspiracy that created the United States, the friendship of our nation with other nations on these principles, in this case France, and then we'll be joined by my husband Chris Sayre, and historian, to continue this. But let me bring on Jacques now. So hello, Mr. Cheminade. I'm so glad you're with us, and I think you can go ahead.
Well, thanks a lot to invite me. I would better be if I was with you there, with all of you there, because you are fighting for the right cause in a forceful way, and you will have good news coming in the near future. My presentation is based on what we used to say, one fist across the Atlantic. It's to give a sense of the spirit of the American Revolution, starting from the spirit of the French conference that took place in Paris of the Schiller Institute and Solidarité et Progrès. It is first team spirit. You work with a team spirit, and you organize, and you organize. And that's what's about the American-French alliance with other nations for the independence of the United States, the American Revolution. It proves that a nominally weaker force can win against an oppressor, provided it fights with a patriotic and international standpoint, an international view, spirit. It was not only France that was involved, or French patriots that were involved in this war. It was patriots from all Europe and even beyond Europe. I will tell you later how. It was the American War of Independence was in fact a world war, something that had a dimension of a world war, the First Republic fighting for its existence. What should be first understood is that the American alliance, French-American alliance, was signed on February 6, 1778. February 6, 1778. But the main things after the victory at Saratoga. But many things happened before, and the most interesting things happened before. First, it started when in 1775, the Continental Congress of the United States declared, I quote, that the foreign support is necessary without any doubt. So it was not an intervention of the France or whatever of French patriots inside the United States. It was the civil citizens of the United States that called for support to make of it an international fight. Louis XVI, the French king, was at first hesitant, but people around him convinced him, in the circles associated with Lafayette, that you know, to inspire the king to intervene. At first, the king decided to do it in secrecy, but he had problem before. What I want is humiliation of England. And it was at these first years, in the 1775, 76, that Silas Deer and Thomas Jefferson were in Paris to promote the alliance. The French then provided the American rebels with weapons of, I would say, a guerrilla type weapons, like small guns and small cannons. Weapons to lead these fights were crucial, and after the French heavier weapons were crucial in the Battle of Saratoga, for example, and also in Yorktown. As for money, because all revolutions have to be financed, as for money, it's Beaumarchais who organized the inflow of money coming to the United States. The French authorities did not want it to be so public, so Beaumarchais had to play his tricks. It was known because one day in the city of Nantes, there was an opera, Rossini's opera, the Barbiere di Sevilla, the Barber of Seville, was given, of Sevilla in Spain, was given, and there is in the Barber of Sevilla the air of slander. And Beaumarchais was slandered because they said he's a thief, he makes hoaxes, he's a bad guy. But then Beaumarchais was present in the theater, and when the air of slander came in the Barbiere di Sevilla, all the crowd raised and applauded Beaumarchais. So it proved that there was a support in France, at least in the layers of the bourgeoisie. There was a real burgeoisie, there were a support for the American Revolution. Marquis de Lafayette arrived on June 13, 1777 in the United States. At his first battle, he was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. Later, he came back to the US, and then he came back also to France to convince Louis XVI to be public about it, not only secret support, but to be public. And the alliance treaty itself was negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, who had been organizing. What he had said before, and this refers to Beaumarchais, what Beaumarchais had to do. He said the French, they are willing to give their life and their honor. They are very courageous people. But as for the money, it's not so easy with them. So, yes, you should know as an element about the way Beaumarchais and others had to arrange to have the financing of the revolution. Also, on Benjamin Franklin, I would say that Poor Richard's Almanac was, in what organized the American population, was in part inspired by Rabelais, a way to communicate science and deeper conceptions of humanity to persons that barely know to read. The advantage in the United States, that explains the difference between the American and the French Revolution. In the United States, about 75% of the people knew how to read. In France, it was only at best 20-25%. So people knowing how to read, Franklin said, it's a Bible mostly that they were reading. They would have something else than the Bible. And that's why he created this first Richard's Almanac to inspire the population in the United States and to have them ready for the higher conception of their individual sovereignty, which would make them supportive of the national sovereignty. So it's very important, the land support for the American Revolution, but the key role was played by the French Navy. You should see I have a quote, an interesting quote from Washington, not of the French Navy, but what he said to his troops. I was this morning favored with yours, it's addressed to General Heath. I was this morning favored with yours containing the pleasing accounts of the late arrivals at Portsmouth and Boston, that of the French ships of war with artillery and other military stores is most valuable. So the French Navy played a key role, especially after 1778, but even before. After 1778, the French Navy and officially the French Treasury gave the support. And then it became, the alliance was public. Rochambeau, De Grasse, Suffren, Destin were the names of the people involved in the fight of the Navy. Rochambeau not, but the others, De Grasse, Suffren, and Destin. And the Navy battle for the American Revolution started in French waters, which it shows it was international, at the Isle of Ouessant, where the British and the French Navy fought. It's off the coast of Brittany in France, Bretagne. Also, it should show that the Spanish Armada entered also in the war against the British. And the French also led fights. The first fights were near the Admiral de Grasse, were near Granada, the islands of Granada. So it was not only on American territory, on the American soil, but it was an international battle on international seas. Destin was in the United States on the summer, now with a big fleet, on the summer of 1778. 14 frigates and 12, I don't know how you say that in English or in American, it's capital ships or ships of the line. It was a big fleet. So he was in the Battle of Granada, as I said before, that was July 6, 1778. And then Rochambeau arrived with a fleet of 6,000 French soldiers to support Washington. It's a lot. So French allied also with the Indians. This is not so known, with Indian troops, and they won the Battle of Gekionga in 1780. So that's important because it shows that American and French at that point were not trying to raid the Indians. They were trying to include them in the War of Independence. It's only after that the Americans committed their murderous campaigns against the Indians, but it was inspired by a British spirit. It's when there was a British spirit that gained the United States that this was done. It was not the genuine American sense of patriotic independence. So the French had the French Navy had this crucial victory against the British fleet. It is known as Chesapeake Bay in 1781, and then the victory of Yorktown with Rochambeau leading the French troops. So this you know probably, but what you probably don't know is that the French war against the British also was taking place in India, World War. In India, the French forces allied with Hyder Ali, the Indian, I think it was Agora, leader, in 1782, 1783. And the war in India was led to relieve the American forces and to have a conflict, which was in the whole war. The French had 3,000 French troops in India, and they won, together with Hyder Ali, the Battle of Trincomalee. So this was a world war once again. This is when it's said that it was Surcouf who said it. We don't know for sure, but it was the spirit of these fights of the French against the British. A British, I think he was a vice admiral, said to the French Corsair Surcouf, "Oh, you the French, you fight for money, while us British, we fight for honor." And Surcouf answered, "Everyone is fighting for what they lack." So that was the spirit of these fights. The Paris Treaty was signed in September 3, 1783, and that was a victory of the American independence. Something very important to stress is the Polytechnique and Arts et Métiers movement. Polytechnique was a high military school, and Arts et Métiers was a school where they trained the highest level of workers and people involved in industry. So this is the engineer tradition of France. China is today, it is said, a society of engineers, and France had lost this drive. They are still good engineers, but they have lost this drive of society as a whole. France was a society that was becoming at the time a society of engineers, inspired West Point. And we have to say also something that before Napoleon transformed Polytechnique in a full-time military institution, military per se, before in Polytechnique, they had choruses, they had music, they had singing, and painting. They studied the works of Leonardo, for example. So that, I think, also had this influence in American, in West Point and in all American military institutions, making of the top American generals people like you would see in some of them today, like McGregor or others, who have a culture. They are not just studying military operations, they have a culture behind it, and it's very important. What happened later, and we hope today to have reached a point for the spirit of French American and also German, Italian, and others, Spanish friendship, and fight together, this teamwork, is reviving. Because what happened after 1778, after the alliance, and the victory of 1783, what happened is that the fight between France and the United States. The British did everything, even as early as that. After they did even worse, but as early as that, they did operations inside the United States, inside France, and even in between France and the United States to divide France from the United States. In 1794, the United States signed a trade treaty with Great Britain. And as a result, there was a quasi-French-American war between 1798 and 1800. And the French reacted not in a way of organizing the Americans that were doing before, but fighting them on a simple conception of enemies because they were trading with Great Britain, and not a concept to change them. So that was also a collapse in the view of the French, and then came Napoleon, in the view of the French, no more as a country uplifting other countries and fighting for liberty, life, liberty, and the search of happiness, but France fighting with national interest per se, not patriotic interest as a patriot, a world citizen would do. LaRouche, remember, says, citizens of the world unite, and that's today the spirit we should have, with a steam spirit, in the sense of what was done during the years of the American independence. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. That actually, Chris and I will bring Chris up right now, my husband, historian. We're talking yesterday about the so-called French Indian War, meaning the Native American population, but also it being in India. Your point about this being really a world war is very important. And I know Lyndon LaRouche spoke a lot about the 1763 treaty, which somehow turned over India to the British. And this makes that more clear. But I think Chris may have some responses, and then we can go back and forth, because a lot of what you just said, Jacques, is I find quite provocative and exciting, and I think our listeners will too. Chris, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, well, I just wanted to show just some graphics that would just elucidate what Jacques just went through. So how do I bring up the first one?
You have to tell me. I don't think you're allowed to.
Okay, so bring up 1781 roots of, yeah, there we are. Okay, so this is what Jacques was just referring to. If you, well, one of the things he was referring to, the roots of Washington and Rochambeau in 1781. If you look at the top, you see Rhode Island, and that's where Rochambeau landed with the 6,000 troops that Jacques referenced. And so you can see he marches down through Connecticut, and he meets up with Washington in White Plains, New York. And there's a meeting between Washington and Rochambeau. And at that point, one interesting thing was, it wasn't clear. Washington was talking about taking back New York, which was where the British had, I mean, he had already lost New York early on in the war, 1776, and then of course he makes the whole trip down to the retreat, the famous retreat down to Pennsylvania, and the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, where it's a turning point, where we have some major victories finally. But in the process of that, the British take over New York. That's their base of operations in the colonies during the Revolution. And so Washington is still talking about taking back New York, whereas it's clear, I mean, the French are very clear, that's probably not going to be the winning strategy. We've got to get down to Virginia and meet the British troops as they come up, British and Hessian troops as they come up from the south. So you can see, so he meets Washington though, and he hands over his 6,000 troops. He hands over the army, the French army, to Washington at that point, which shows you, the respect that the French did have for Washington as a general and a leader. And so you can see the route going down towards Yorktown. Now, at the same time, you see the blue line there, de Grasse, coming up from the islands. Jacques may know exactly what he was doing in the islands at the time, but I guess a lot of there were battles against the British at that point in the islands going on at the same time, right? He comes up, and let me just switch over. Go to 1781 Washington Lafayette. Just want to show you. There's George Washington and General Lafayette right behind him, who was like a son to him. And I mean, it was a very, very close. And Jacques, I want to ask you some questions on this after I just go through this brief thing here. But Lafayette was like a son to General Washington, one of the closest people in Washington's life was Lafayette. And he said when Lafayette returned the second time after being wounded in Brandywine, he was so overjoyed, like a son coming back to join the battle again. Okay, so back to the roots of Washington, and okay, there we are. So what you have is Washington, Lafayette, Hamilton, who has insisted at this point, I don't want to be an aide de camp. I don't want to be your aide per se, General Washington. I want to be in battle. And so in Yorktown, Hamilton goes into battle. And the famous, I think it's Redoubt 10, that where Hamilton goes over the line and basically attacks the British, and the whole operation is successful. But the point is that the British are stuck on this peninsula, and they cannot retreat because de Grasse has them pinned in from the bay, from the Chesapeake Bay. So the French Navy has them pinned in the bay. Rochambeau, Lafayette, Washington, Hamilton have them pinned in Yorktown, and it's the decisive victory. And you can go to the next slide, the surrender. There we are, and there are the British surrendering in Yorktown, and that was the essential defeat of the British at that point. I mean, the war continued on until the Treaty of Paris officially ended it in 1783, but that was the decisive defeat. And it is absolutely the case that without French aid at this point, who knows what would have happened? I mean, perhaps we would have won down the road. Let's assume we would have. I mean, it wasn't a winning proposition for the British, to try to maintain the colonies. But thank God for this French help, this brotherly help from France at this point. Now, Jacques, I wanted to ask you a question, because you have people like Rochambeau. I'm sorry. You have people, not Rochambeau. You have people like Beaumarchais, who are obviously Republicans with a small R, and you see it in his in the Barber of Seville and other things that he wrote, and his early on working with Franklin to get the necessary means to the American patriots. And you have people like Lafayette, who at a very early age, what is he, 18 years old when he first comes over, maybe 17, I don't know. He's very young when he is infused with the American revolutionary spirit.
And something that is not so known is that he had to leave from Spain. He could not leave from France. And he lived in a very small boat. The first time in my life, I was in my early 20s, that I saw the Hermione, the small ship. It looked so small to cross the Atlantic on such a thing. So he had to pay for his own money to go. At the time, Louis XVI was still hesitating. He helped in secrecy a bit. Vergennes was supporting, his minister was supporting the American Revolution, but others were not. And finally, it's Lafayette who made the decisive step to have the revolution supported.
Wow. Right. Right. So I guess that's kind of my question is it seems like in anything else, I mean, we're organizers. And so Lafayette was an organizer. Beaumarchais was an organizer. I mean, and you had the king, Louis XVI, who obviously this is a funny thing because it's an American Revolution against a king. In this case, it's the King of England, who France is at essentially, an enemy of France. But just because England is a longtime enemy of France doesn't necessarily mean same thing with like Catherine the Great in Russia. You had people around her that were pro-American Revolution, but it didn't mean that she was necessarily in favor of a successful revolution against a king, because it sets a very bad precedent if you are a czar or a king or a queen. But so I just wanted to get a sense of, like, you had these people in France who were obviously Republicans, and somehow they were able to organize the king to do this. I mean, do you have any sense of how that worked? I mean, how that organizing occurred?
Well, it's not such a simple story. There was all these people coming from the Enlightenment. So they were in favor of the American Revolution. They were in the circles around the king, but their thinking was not really Republican. They pretended to be, but they weren't really in the way they thought. They have the thinking, they were in a certain way liberals inside their minds, even if they were with emotions for the American Revolution. Louis XVI was not such a bad man, and he could be convinced because of that, and he had a few very key ministers around him. You have to know that not only Benjamin Franklin had read Confucius, and I don't remember if he translated it, but in France, this was also done in the circles. So there was this kind of spirit. But France never made the decisive step to get rid, to reach the level of the consentment of the ruled. So the monarchy never managed to reach that, and that was why there was a revolution after. Louis XVI was afraid by his own people, and Marie Antoinette, who was a queen who came from the Austrian monarchy, was even more afraid. So this created a situation for the finally, during the French Revolution, they betrayed and went to the enemy. And that a catastrophe started in the revolution with that. Also, you have another thing that you have to understand, that we have to understand, is that the fact that the Americans were reading the Bible were more close to a conception of humanity than was the French population. The taking of the Bastille, which now celebrated as Bastille Day on July 14th. That's also very interesting. It's not only Bastille Day. Some said, and they are becoming a majority, that it was in 1790, which was the day where Lafayette tried to make it a celebration of the Federation, the French Federate States. So there was all this, I say that because there was all this motion and contradictory motion in the circles, including for Lafayette himself. Lafayette was at his best when he was in the United States, of course, and he played this crucial role in the independence, and he was his best when he toured the United States in 1824. But when he was involved in the events of 1830 in France, he had also this hesitation. And finally, it's Louis Philippe that became the King of France, and Orléans to replace the Bourbons. And Lafayette did not make at this point the decisive step. It's when Edgar Allan Poe, Fenimore Cooper, and other things, other people were around France and coming to France. So you have, in the majority, people were against the British in France, because they were against the British Empire and to humiliate the British, as Louis XVI said. But in terms of their thinking, they had not broken with the British conception or Aristotelian conception of things. You have a similar thing in the United States today. They have a lot of young people, and not so young people, but many young people, that are against volunteer, against the Silicon Valley landlords, etc. They are against them. But the thinking has not yet broke to a higher level. So that's why now that everybody knows how to read, write, and there are universities and there are schools, at that point we have to organize this population to get out of what I called the Aristotelian intelligence, not artificial intelligence, and make a step further and break with that rules of the game and reach the level of thinking of Benjamin Franklin, Lynn, and in France, at that point, there were the people like Carnot who founded Polytechnique and who said that what has to be done in a society is that every human being should be raised to the level of humanity, every human being, and that's to be Republican. So this is what we have to do now in France, in the United States, and the whole world.
I want to come in here because I think this is so important, and the point you made about the French being only 25% literate at this time, and the much higher literacy rate in the colonies of the United States, even if they did not have many books to read. But if you go to visit the leaders, like the home of John Adams and John Quincy Adams in Massachusetts, they have a massive, huge library, and they are reading in many languages, and they're reading philosophers and great thinkers of all over the world. And this is a problem we see also in war. You cannot make a revolution and you cannot have a victory in war if you have no conception of what the end result will be. That is, you must have a positive conception of the next platform of humanity so that you have a direction like the North Star of where you are going. Otherwise, it is simply not enough to be against. And I think we see that so much, and it makes it very easy to divide people in this binary way where you're for this and against this, and then they line up everybody into kind of tribal positions. Whereas if you had a positive conception above where people are headed, then instead of dividing people, you could unite them, as Abraham Lincoln said, by the better angels of their nature. And I think this is so urgent, and people don't give much thought to it.
I think that persistence is something key, because you have the revolution, you have the victory, but then you have to keep it, as Benjamin Franklin said about the American Constitution. And sometimes people, like after 1945, the French resistance of the Free French, they get relieved or too humble, and then those that led the fight go back home out of, they have not the sense of their own importance. And this true sense of its own importance, is true humility, creative humility. This what should be raised in the minds and in the spirit of the people. And I think that's a big challenge in the present circumstances for all of us. Because the history is made of renaissance. You have a renaissance, but then step back, and then again a renaissance, and then step back. And today we have a chance. Citizens of the world unite, is what it means. We are all in the same boat. We know all what we are. There is this communication, and we have no right. We should not be allowed to let it go this time. There should be a permanent Renaissance, ending the British imperialism, the similar imperialisms in Spain, Portugal, France, or other countries, and even in Germany with, before World War One. You have that imperial, which it was in the Treaty of Paris, where they shared the world. We have to get out of that. We have to get out of this colonialism, and we have to create a society of free people because they want others to be free.
When you speak of the Treaty of Paris, you mean the first one in 1763, yeah?
No, I mean the
No?
Treaty of Berlin
Oh.
that shared the world.
Oh, okay.
Of course, the Treaty of Paris 1763 is similar. It's in a similar way. All these treaties sharing the world are really the poison of the history of nations, because it's imperial sharing.
I'd like to ask you about Carnot and the École Polytechnique, because it was either 75 or 76. We set up a corps of engineers in the United States out of necessity to win the war. And Duportel comes from France, and he comes from those engineering circles in France. And he becomes a key. He is the chief engineer in the United States for securing the victory, all the way through to Yorktown. But so I wanted to just, because later on, this whole question of Lafayette, and I mean, we've been doing a series. We started a history series, where we did 2 presentations on George Washington and the American Revolution, the creation of the Constitution, and the first presidency as he established it. And we're going to get into Monroe next as another great president, and then John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State. And so, and Monroe, it's very, very interesting because he is the first ambassador to France under the Washington administration. And he comes from this faction that was more pro-French Revolution versus the Federalists, who were anti-French Revolution and supposedly more pro-British, this kind of thing, that you can see immediately this faction fight that breaks out. And what you were describing just a few minutes ago of instead of having a concept of Republican, people immediately fall into this trap of what side are you on? Are you pro-French or are you pro-British? Are you this or that? And of course, George Washington was neither. He was pro-Republican and pro-American, and wanted to organize the rest of the world around that principle. But so I guess the first question that I have is, what was going on with Carnot and the École Polytechnique and that relationship with the United States?
Well, it's very interesting because usually people know that the French architect L'Enfant had a plan to build Washington, but they don't know, which is much more important, what you said, the connection of these science people and these engineers who built, in fact, the best of the United States and France, and were connected. This Polytechnique, West Point, but not only. And in France, Carnot was the one who defeated all the armies of the aristocrats in Europe when they attacked France. He defeated them militarily. He was called the organizer of the victory. But much more important is what with Monge, with Gaspard Monge and Lazare Carnot, they launched Polytechnique as a place to create the future leadership of the nation. It never worked that way for various reasons, but it worked in a way because these people helped to build France, and they went to Brazil, they went to Argentina, they went to the United States. It was a world movement. This is what has to be understood. And this world movement now can be spread much more. Citizens of the world unite because we have the conditions now. There it was more difficult because there was this, what's happening in one portion of the world was not necessarily known in another portion of the world. As for Carnot, about all this motion in Polytechnic, they created the meter, the conception of the meter. They created the conception of what they called the organized worker, as opposed to the worker that you said to do this and that. They said, no, a worker has to have the industrial judgment, which is very different. They also created the School of Oriental Languages. They created for education l'École Nationale, l'École Normale d'Éducation. They create the first attempt. It did not work at that time, but it worked later in the French history, of have people teaching in the villages and organized by the regions or by the ruling. What also one thing to be stressed, which I think I want to go back on this question of persistence. Robespierre, you know, was a good guy at the beginning. He was organized by the Oratorians, and he delivered in 1792 one of the best speeches, or relatively best speeches, against wars. And he said, France cannot lead itself, lead its ideas with the bayonets, he should lead with the ideas. Very good speech. And then, because he had no persistence, there was not a social environment around him, and his weaknesses, they preyed on him, and he became this horrible guy who massacred people, the Jacobin massacre with a guillotine. So you see, it's not win forever. You have every morning, every time to fight, and this is persistence. And what I like a lot myself, when I know that the first rovers launched on the moon were called by they asked young American adolescents, young people, to give names. The first name was given by a young girl of 14, as I heard, and called it Discovery. And then there was a second one called, how it's called? It was not persistence, it was
Perseverance.
Exactly.
Perseverance. Yeah.
So this sense is still there in the youth. You have only to let's say, to inspire them to do something about it and not listen to those that try with artificial intelligence or other means to bring them down. The fear that I have, and I would conclude with that, is that artificial intelligence is not a danger for humanity, as Elon Musk thinks, because he is himself probably part of it. He is an artificial intelligence in the way he behaves and he does. A sophisticated one, but he's one. So you have artificial intelligence cannot threaten humanity as a new thing. And it threats humanity, but to bring down humanity to the level of its way of thinking, of non-thinking, of this way of being a data, having all the data, but never a creative idea. And I think this is key for the youth in the way you teach them, because if, even imperfectly, you give them the sense of what is creation, the creative idea, and not follow me and answer after me, as Lenin would say, then you have something which now we have a tremendous opportunity in the whole world, and in particular in countries that has been relatively less infected than countries of Africa.
It also, I think, underscores why music and painting and poetry and these arts would be such an important part of a military academy or an engineering academy. Because what you see in any of these arts is that the truth, as we know, is we cannot in the physical mortal domain express the truth. It is not a thing. But through metaphor, you can actually create, you can transmit a true idea from one human mind to the next, but never in a literal fashion, which really seems to be quite a paradox. But that is uh, unique to human beings and our ability to communicate and the ability to rekindle in another mind a process of discovery through the arts, or as Lyndon LaRouche would say, the recreation, reconstructing a scientific experiment for yourself so that you are able to know that there is a principle which is not a quote unquote fact.
I know Diane had just got to fight and for the existence of a chorus in the United States. This was in Polytechnic. The science institution had choruses. And the one who tried it, and Napoleon destroyed it because he had this military sense, military per se, was Wilhelm. He was called Wilhelm. And he continued even after the fall of Napoleon, he continued the monarchy, and he managed to have choruses of hundreds and even thousands, it seems, of people. So the French popular poet, Béranger was his name, so that this was impossible to have people singing in masses or relative masses properly. So they went to see, it was 1841, he went to see Wilhelm and watch what he was doing. And then he said, yes, you could do it. So he said, if you have people singing properly in choruses, it's a very beautiful poem. If you have people singing properly in chorus, well tuning, with a good voice, you create a sense of brotherhood. Fraternité is called in French. It's one, liberté, égalité, fraternité is a French motto for France. So he said fraternité. You can reach this level of brotherhood because you respect each voice. They have their own register, and together they do much better if they were individually. So if the Republic was on that way, he said, and if you sing properly with a well-tuned voice, then it was an example for the world, and brotherhood could reach a whole universe.
Yes, I think that's right. And we did have a president, Grant, who really organized on that principle with the Peace Jubilee with a chorus of 10,000 voices, and the audience was 40,000 at the end of the so-called Civil War to pull the country together. It's absolutely right. On this question, I just wanted to go back because my thinking is changed by our visit and discussion actually about the American Revolution. And I think this is part of the problem we have here also with this libertarian idea that everything is in isolation. As an American, one doesn't tend to think very much about how many other forces came in to help us secure this victory. And the fact that the French played such a huge role, we know the names, we know Lafayette, we know L'Enfant. People don't know so much about Rochambeau or Beaumarchais, but even the presence of the French military, the 6,000 troops, the French Navy, it's really, frankly, not very good that Americans don't think of this, because then you put your chest out and you think you're going to bluster around the world. We are the greatest, the sole superpower. And in fact, even our own revolution was not like that. And also, as you both were pointing out, there were many alliances with the various Native American nations being played by all sides. So this was indeed very complex. It was not simple. And now I'm thinking about, I had not understood when Lyndon LaRouche said that one of the factors of why the revolution was so urgent, that people would have been aware. He talked about the conditions in India and the conditions imposed by the British East India Company, why this would be in the mind so much of Americans, but it becomes more clear that it must have been in their consciousness, the implications of remaining a colony. If you looked at the genocidal practices of the British in India, that was perhaps where we were headed over here.
Well, if you speak about the infection of the mind, in the French Revolution, what Fouché, who was the worst that you can imagine as a servant of the British without being British, he mastered the environment, the cultural environment of revolution by running the casinos at the time, and the tripots, they call it in French, paying for the better money, and the brothels. And he said, with that, I run a country. And unfortunately, people on top were not, they were not like him, but they used him because it was convenient. And instead of trying to raise the level of all of them, I have a work from Émile Zola in France, which is called Assommoir. It's a sort of people poisoned by alcohol. And there is a woman called Gervaise, who is a woman, I mentioned that in my books that I just written. This woman, Gervaise, managed to succeed in society anywhere or another, being a cleaning person. So they organize this dinner, they are all happy, and they want to sing, and they start singing. And they sing these horrible things from what they call the café concert at the time. It was a sort of places where they sang all these songs about dirty things done by people or military. And then they start thinking that. So you see a society where these people were not provided with what I said before, the capacity, because it was the end of the 19th century, it was not 1841. So these were not provided with what is needed to be a human being. And nonetheless, the Schiller birthday was celebrated by Meyerbeer, a French composer, German origin. And all this Schiller was celebrated, but it was not given to the people. It was done by a certain layer of connoisseurs in Paris, and not for the population. And this is this thrive, I don't know if you say that, to work for the population is what is needed. It's something that passion in your soul. I want to be the best of myself, not to be seen as a person which is respectable or admired, but on the contrary, a person which always thinks of the work for the other, for the benefit of the other. Westphalia, LaRouche.
Yes. So I think we're coming up on time, and I'm going to ask Chris what thoughts you have, and then Jacques, I will come back to you. Chris, please go ahead.
Well, I would just say, I think, I have a better understanding now. Thank you, Jacques. And the what Carnot did, if it didn't succeed in France, later on when the Army Corps of Engineers really took on the mission in the Monroe administration, and then John Quincy Adams, that Carnot's victory was here because we created an Army Corps, and of course, people like Sylvanus Thayer went to France and grabbed up as many French engineering writings as he could, and brought them back to West Point, and that was made the key part of the curriculum, the engineering curriculum at West Point, and we studied how to make canals and how to develop ports and how to develop the nation, and that came from the École Polytechnique, and that was a gift from those souls in France. And I was just thinking about when we were in Syracuse, Diane, that park where there's a statue of Friedrich Schiller there. There were clearly people who tried to bring that culture to the people, to the worker, and we've got to do that. We've got to uplift our population. That's so that this can be a real successful. The next 250 years can be successful in our republic, and so I mean those are just some thoughts that I had on this, and I think of course Lafayette coming back, which we're going to talk about soon, and Lafayette coming back in 1824 as a son of the American Revolution, to secure the victory of John Quincy Adams. That was a major turning point in the history of our country. Had Lafayette not come back, had that victory not been secured, God knows what would have happened in our nation. So it's these unique individuals in history that persevere and fight for principle, even if they're not perfect, but they fight for a principle and they move humanity forward. And that's how we have to humbly think of ourselves in this task that we have in front of us.
Jacques, closing thoughts.
If you look at Polytechnic today, you would despair because only 20% of the people go to the public sector, 80% to trade and financial positions, and finance, and they speculate. So, but the spirit is still there, maybe not in people that graduate from Polytechnic, because it's the teaching is more learning after me and repeat after me. Instead, it's the people when they join Polytechnic and all the people that want to have this education of their creative powers, we have that chance to have them all around, not only those who want to join Polytechnic. And there's this tradition of, let's say, the educative powers of all of us. And I think that is in the United States and in France, because there are republics and because there is a sense degraded today or totally betrayed of the institutions of the presidency corresponding to the service of the people. But I think nonetheless, the principle, as you said before, is still there. And that's why the 10 principles of LaRouche are something that could create a revival of institutions that have been misled.
Thank you. I think that's very important, and we have to do it. And I'm also thinking of this process, which is another discussion. Perhaps you, myself, and Helga LaRouche could have a roundtable on what has become of the election process in each of our nations to try by this oligarchical elite to silence that impulse on the part of the population and the impulse for the general welfare. So I want to go on. You're going to say something?
Yes, thank you very much. And I hope that sooner than some expect, you would deserve the reward that you, Chris, really should be given. Certain conditions that are coming.
Yes, the conditions. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who is watching. And we will be with you again next week, provided none of our leaders does anything so insane that we are not able to meet again. So thanks for listening. Sign up at the LaRoucheOrganization.org and subscribe to the EIR with a recurring LaRouche Organization membership.